Good morning and welcome to the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. This morning, 6 Mississippi police officers have pleaded guilty to state charges after pleading guilty to federal charges in the torture of 2 Black men. We'll discuss that briefly this morning. And The Blind Side, you remember the movie with Sandra Bullock? This great story about this white family taking in this young Black homeless guy child who was in foster care after foster care, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the story, which won an Oscar, turns out may not have been true at all. And what that family is alleged to have done to this Black football player, we'll talk about that as well. And also this morning, a special segment on mental health within the African American community. Today, we delve into a topic of paramount importance: the accessibility and cultural resonance of therapy for people of color. Recent research has shed light on a concerning disparity between the number of people of color or therapists of color and those seeking their services. We got 3 experts on this morning to talk about it. But first, let's bring on Sonny. Not Sonny, I'm sorry. Sonny's going to be with us, though, y'all. But Dr. Jeff Menzies, who is a doctor of clinical psychology. Dr. Menzies, how are you?
Hey, good morning, man. How you doing, Stacey?
Doing good. We decided to start with you first before we bring in our other 2 great panelists this morning, just to go over two really, really, I think, important topics that
Yeah.
have been in the news of late. Just wanted to get your thoughts on them first and foremost. 5 former deputies from the Rankin County Sheriff's Office and 1 former officer from the Richland Police Department have admitted to federal and now state charges related to a racially motivated attack that occurred in January. The officers are Christian Dedman, Hunter Elwood, Brett McAlpin, Jeffrey Middleton, Daniel Updike, and Joshua Hartfield, all white. And I'm pretty sure you've at least heard of this story, Dr. Menzies. The torture and sexual assault and everything else on these Black men, these 2 Black men in Mississippi, horrendous. Since we're going to talk mental health today, how does one even begin to recover from this?
So we're talking about not only the man who experienced or the people, because we know about this one situation,
Right.
and this is truly not isolated, one, but we're talking not only about his individual recovery physically as well as psychologically, but also even this young brother in this picture right here holding a sign. The people who are exposed to this information are also being traumatized, even though they can't necessarily be formally diagnosed with PTSD because of the way they experience the trauma. But this is still trauma for the entire community. It feeds more into the ongoing trauma that Black people have when encountering police, right? Because now it's like, see, we're not crazy. See, this stuff does happen. See, I knew that cop when he pulled me over was a psychopathic killer, right? And this is what's gonna support those feelings and those insights that Black people have. And so it's going to take a lot to heal, if healing is even possible. We may never return back to normal.
Well, and to your point too, so the backstory too is that the owner of the house, the landlord, is a white woman whom apparently there was some friction about whether it was a rent payment being late or just simply the fact that these 2 Black men had rented her place. These 6 officers, known as I guess the Goon Squad is what they were called. They barge into the home and for 2+ hours. In one case, one of the victims is 2 Black men victims here. They placed a gun. One of the officers placed his gun in the victim's mouth and fired the gun, severely injuring him. They called the monkey and the N word repeatedly. They poured milk and other liquids on them, forced them into the shower to get rid of evidence, to wash away evidence. They also, in one instance, attempted to use and folks, a sex toy to rape one of the men. It just went on and on, Dr. Menzies. So your point about why Black people more than just the victims, and particularly the victims are traumatized and will be traumatized, but Black people in general, they see this, and this is why we see. Is this why we see what we saw in Montgomery?
So it's interesting you bring Montgomery up, but yeah. So in this case, it's also a situation of weaponizing the police, right? And so these police were weaponized. Their landlord, whoever was governing the building, called the police and sent them to attack, almost like attack dogs. And we know about situations where that happens as well. The weaponization of police. We've seen quote unquote so-called Karens calling the police, totally making up the story. Remember the woman with the dog, matter of fact, as dogs bark, with the dog in the park where the guy was bird watching. She's like, help, she's strangling her dog while calling the police and telling a bold-faced lie. But in Montgomery, I think that what we saw there was, it was like people saw an opportunity to finally fight back, to finally defend themselves. And there's so much that goes around that situation, especially the location of it. The fact that it is in Alabama, in this case, is in Mississippi. So we're talking about deep South now, further South. And so, yes, I think the tides are changing. But I want us to be very, very cautious and very, very aware that, that we should have strategic responses, and make sure that we're responding appropriately to these situations. And, appropriately could be a wide range of things, depending on who you're talking to. But self-defense and strategy and being aware is very important in situations like this. But that healing part, man, I mean, I feel so bad for not only the two brothers, especially getting shot in the mouth. I mean, this is horrendous stuff. And it's the wildest part to me, maybe not the wildest, but it's wild that this is so common that it just turns into just a kind of like a casual conversation about the situation.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. It's so interesting because I mentioned at the top, we want to talk about these stories. And I don't know if we was on air yet when I said it, but before they get stale, this should never get stale. Right. This is a story that should have tentacles everywhere, right?
Yep. And it should sting. It should sting. You should hear this and your stomach should turn. But I tell you the truth, my stomach didn't turn. And I think that because it's become normalized. We don't want it to go stale, but we also don't want it to normalize either. Mm-hmm. And so there's a process to where you can desensitize people, to things. And experiencing ongoing trauma does eventually desensitize you to the trauma. And so, people develop pain thresholds. People develop drinking tolerance where they have to drink more to get drunk. And so we could be developing a tolerance to our own trauma, the harming of Black minds and bodies and souls.
Yeah. And Sonny Etienne joins us as well in the conversation. Sonny, hearing Dr. Jeff talk about this and the trauma behind it. You talk to someone comes to you, Sonny Etienne, with a problem like this. I mean, this is with trauma like this, I should say. What do you say to them? You're on mute, Sonny.
Good morning to all. Well, first, I think you want to join with them. You want to validate what they've gone through, because in this country of ours, so many times our stories are not believed. This is a travesty of epic proportions. And so as a clinician, our job is to both confirm what they went through, but moreover is to provide them with the tools to navigate what is a very, very scary times. We know when often these situations occur, there's still this fear that looms over the victim with just what could happen with the police department. There's so much injustice that goes on, within a lot of these local branches. So then you're faced now also with media scrutiny, or just some of the negative rhetoric you hear on social media with those that pretty much are cheering on, these officers. And so for the victims and for those who, as Dr. Menzies pointed out, who are observing this on television sets, it's this reinforcement of this fear that we have as Black men. I think the last time I was on this show, I had alluded to my being stopped by a police officer with the guns to my head. This was just in February.
Right.
Test driving a car.
Test driving, gosh.
Test driving a car, So
wow.
Even Mr. Sonny, we this is my reality. Interestingly enough, and with that incident, the person from the car dealership was asking me, what led to this? And I looked at him and I said, and he said, got you. But all joking aside, though, this is certainly a tragedy. And I think as therapists, mental health providers, our work is in helping persons who go through this, and persons, particularly children who, young Black boys who face this reality. It's to give them the support that they need, and to also, have the quote unquote talk with them, but then again, there are so many times when, sleeping while Black, bird watching while Black, in this case,
taking the garbage out while Black, the little kid the other day,
so, you feel bad also because I was looking at the article, these officers are pleading guilty, but then there's this concern of, will justice be served? And so Blacks we continue to live with this fear of, is anything ever going to be done about this? Even though these guys have quote unquote pleaded guilty. So I'm sorry,
go ahead. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
No, I was just finishing up with just saying that our roles as health providers is to help our patients, moreover, address this anxiety, address this panic, address this PTSD, as Dr. Menzies pointed out, as best we can, and provide them with the tools for how to navigate the fears that they experience very much on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and Dr. Menzies, these guys, rightfully so, have filed I believe it was a $700 million lawsuit against the department, these officers, and some folks will say, they're going to get paid. Talk about that mentality, if you will, because you see it not just people on social media, but you go into a grocery store and you have this conversation. Oh, well, at least they're going to get paid.
Right. Yeah. Those are people who don't understand and who didn't experience the physical and the psychological abuse directly. That's what that's plainly just that, and it's that. And we think that the monetary reward is winning. Right. Because we're in a society where, litigation is what it is. And people want to sue. And then, not to mention the attorneys that might be backing them. But then also we're reaching for some form of justice, if you will. So like even reparations, a lot of times that conversation is about some type of financial restitution. But at least in that case, there is a financial aspect to it, to where, people have come up greatly financially based on the free labor. But in this situation, I think it's just picking for straws. We're looking for something, some type of reward, some type of compensation, none of which will be justice for real. I mean, in this type of situation, Mr. Fuller, when he talks about justice, it's a whole nother ball game. It's like you have to have something equal. And these six, I can't call them people for real. These six ghouls, they call themselves goons. I'll call them ghouls. These six ghouls, what they did was something out of a horror film. It was something out of like Saw or something like that. I mean, the level of torture. And Dr. Joy DeGruy, she said it some years ago in post-traumatic slave syndrome. She said that back in the day when we were plantation prisoners, I'm paraphrasing, of course, that these sick, like literally sick, mentally sick and maniacal and demonic people had the opportunity to do any and everything they wanted to us because we were their prisoners and there was no oversight. And she says now these same people, they still exist. She says they're on the internet now, but they're also in police uniform. They're also in hospital rooms doing surgery. These people still have this sickness of racism in them. And I'm not saying, I'm not excusing it with sickness, but the manifestation of it is very sick. Yeah. And they are in these positions of power, in these positions of influence to where they can do these things oftentimes unchecked and oftentimes without justice visiting them in the right way.
Well, and a couple quick things on this. Power 96, he's right. He corrected me, not 700 million, but $400 million in the lawsuit is the lawsuit. And he says, how can you shoot someone in the mouth and not be charged with attempted murder? And again, it goes back to your point about justice. They always say ladies first. In this case, we didn't have the lady first, but the lady is always the most powerful, especially when you talk about a Black woman, and a Black woman with a voice like Faye McCray. Faye, who is a health and wellness journalist, how do we record this type of violence as journalists and record as a mental health?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I just want to hook into the point about justice here. Although we can't put a monetary value on what happened and we can't use that to appease it, we are seeing some form of justice here. I mean, we got to see them cuffed. This wasn't a luxury for our ancestors when they were victimized. And I think that that's sort of the role that we see of journalism in these spaces is, look, they're on our TV screens now, they're in our newspapers, and there's shame associated with this behavior. So yes, there's trauma, but I think that we can also craft how we narrate the story. They are ghouls, they are goons. This was atrocious. It was hard to read, even just learning about what happened to these men, these victims, Michael Corey Jenkins and Eddie Terrell Parker. So I think it's really incumbent upon us to cover it as such, and continue to talk about this for what it was. And these were criminals.
Yeah, absolutely. Faye, also, we're both journalists who chronicle things like this. What toll might it take on a journalist, a Black journalist who is chronicling this constant police brutality, white supremacy? It just goes on and on. What toll does it take on a Black journalist?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. And I think it's one that we all probably confront on a regular basis. Sometimes you have to close that computer screen and just take a moment to process. This is not a us and them thing. Oftentimes it's us that we're covering. It's us that we're talking about. And it's really important to make space for that as journalists, that, this isn't, something that we can write about as distant third parties. These are our communities that we're talking about. And we have to make space for the trauma and the toll that it takes on us as well.
And at the same time, we expect it to remain fair and balanced, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And how is that possible at the time?
You can tell by how upset I was about this story in particular.
Look, I've been writing and talking about it on this program about the trials, the indictments of Donald Trump, and going through those things and recognizing, because as journalists, you just don't, at least most of us, we just don't take the surface, right? We try to go beneath the surface and find out other things. And the more we dig, the more stomach turning some of the things we find about the former president. But we got to remain somehow. How do you do it, Faye? Because I can't talk about how I do it. It's not about me. You're the guest. How do you do it? How do you remain fair and balanced?
Yeah, I make space for strong POVs within all the publications that I've worked in. I've said, look, we need to get this voice here. There's room for balance, but there's also room for strong points of view on things. And for me, that's also important as a journalist to highlight those points of view. I won't say which ones that I lean towards, but I will say that that is a bit cathartic for me.
Well, I tell you, I will say this much: what I have done, and speaking of covering the ex-president, and you can go on blackpressusa.com or WashingtonInformer.com or many of our Los Angeles Central other papers and see my reporting on this. I'm always sure to, in every article about the ex-president, Dr. Menzies and Sonny, I mentioned that he was twice impeached. I always mention that. Mm-hmm. You will always see that in my articles about him. He was twice impeached. I mentioned now every time I write about him, 4 times indicted, and also the fact that a civil jury convicted him or found him liable for sexual assault. All of that, because I think it's important. People say, you just can't. It's the same thing over and over again, but you got to remind people, because we have short memories today. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to remind people of that. And maybe some might think that is not fair and balanced, Faye. Is that not fair and balanced?
No, those are the facts, right?
Those are the facts.
Those are the facts.
Well, listen, while we got all of you together, and before we get into the topic of the day, I did also want to mention The Blind Side. Retired NFL star Michael O'Hare, whose supposed adoption out of grinding poverty by a wealthy white family, of course, was immortalized in the 2009 film The Blind Side. He petitioned a Tennessee court this week with allegations that a central element of that story was a lie concocted by the family to enrich itself at his expense. The 14-page petition filed in Shelby County, Tennessee probate court alleges that Sean and Leanne Tui, who took Oher into their home as a high school student, never adopted him. Instead, less than 3 months after he turned 18 in 2004. The petition says that the couple tricked him into signing a document making them his conservators, which gave them legal authority to make business deals in his name. The petition further alleges that the family used their power as conservators to strike a deal that paid them and their 2 birth children millions of dollars in royalties from the Oscar-winning film that earned more than $300 million, while he got nothing for a story that, quote, would not have existed without him. This is wow. When I saw this, when this broke, and again, I'm going to start first with Faye because she's a journalist, and then we'll go to the professionals. But Faye, seeing this, and we're talking about trauma, how do you reconcile this?
Yeah, just frankly, I don't know not one Black person that didn't side-eye that movie when it came out. It was the white savior, it was the magical Negro. I mean, there was just a lot of problematic themes in that movie. So, honestly, I wasn't surprised, when I heard about this. And then when you read more about Michael Orr's story, I mean, he was a ward of the state in Tennessee at the age of 11. He was homeless as a child. This family came to him just as he was about to enter his senior year, and said, we're going to adopt you. I mean, he was vulnerable. He was in a vulnerable position, when they came to him. I'm a mom of a son who's entering his junior year. They don't know a lot at that age. So to expect him to understand what he was signing and what he was getting into when they were promising him the world, it is really sort of ridiculous. So, not at all surprised by this story. Of course, there's a certain degree of impartiality that as we witness and watch this all play out. But, again, not surprised.
So, Dr. Menzies, so Michael discovered this lie and embarrassment, according to his attorney, this past February when he learned that the conservatorship to which he consented on the basis that doing so would make him a member of this family, in fact, provided him no familial relationship with that family. I think Faye broke it down, but again, we're talking a lot about mental health this morning. Yeah. This is devastating to this. It has to be devastating to this young man. He's 37 years old now. He's had an 8-year NFL career, but still must be devastating.
Yeah, they psychologically manipulated him. I mean, as the story reads now, to understand his level of vulnerability, during that period of time, and to basically dangle exactly what they knew he needed the most, which is some type of family to feel stable. I did a lot of my clinical training in foster care and adoptive care services, so this is the population that I clinically trained with. And again, one of the deepest and most persistent desires that a person in that situation has is to be reunited with their biological family. And if not them, then to have a sense of families in one way or another. And so to dangle that in front of this young man and to allegedly psychologically manipulate him into signing, over basically his rights as his person, is one of the cruelest things that you can do psychologically to a person. And another part of me wants to know, what was the background conversation? Was there somebody advising this family to say, hey, we got this young man here. He's big, he's strong, he's a heck of a football player, he's going pro. You want to slide in right now and basically take this guy's life over so that you can manipulate a benefit. It sounds like a slave deal to me, right? And Dr. Wimbush calls them super slaves in his book, The Warrior Method. But it sounds like somebody was on a plantation and this silent auction took place. And this family stepped up, did what they had to do to gain the benefit and access to this person's life to manipulate it to their own wealth generation.
Sonny, they of course they did the movie. It got so much attention, acclaim. $300 million. They won. Sandra Bullock won an Academy Award for it. They did a couple of books about this. When you look at that, when you look at the paper trail here, it seems to lead to just one thing and I think Dr. Menzies just articulated. It seems to mean that leads to the fact that they took this kid in. It was somebody perhaps behind this and said, we can make money off this kid.
Well, yeah, it's sad, but it's pretty much something that, as Dr. Menzies alluded to, when you work with children that are in the foster care system, children that have been adopted or taken in by family members, there's the question of what's the incentive? What's the motivation? What's the intentions behind why they're doing this good act? I remember as a kid growing up watching Different Strokes, I always used to question, why did Mr. Drummond take in those two boys, the Jackson brothers?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to look at, when folks are doing these kind acts, whether or not their hearts are really in the right place. Clearly in this case, a very sad case, sad, but not really surprising. It's that, these children get exploited. A lot of these children in these vulnerable situations, damaged children, some of the toughest populations I've worked with are children who, come from these broken homes, who are then, taken in by these families who don't feel loved. But in a case like this, not only am I being taken in, but I'm being taken advantage of. And it's really, really, really saddening to hear and to learn that, this story is coming out now after all these years, when, this story this film was a blockbuster. I remember watching the NFL Network. It was on loop all the time,
all the time.
This particular story. Yeah. I think he became one of the highest paid left tackles at that point. So, but now you're looking at it in hindsight and you're saying to yourself, like questioning the emancipators.
Wow. And he mentioned, Dr. Menzies, Sonny mentioned Different Strokes. And of course, many might remember, if you're old enough anyway to remember, I thought about that too, even at my young age at that time. Why is it that they had to be taken in by this white guy?
Yeah, it's that white savior thing, it's the, I got to come and save these poor black boys. Because if you remember, at the same time, Sally Struthers was making those commercials about the starving African children too, and so it was all about this white savior mentality. And some say it could have been motivated by white guilt, which might have been a part of it. But another part of it is also to manipulate the psychology of people. The media, a lot of us have media, whether we're just appearing on media platforms or we're actually, contributors and producers of media. We have a very powerful influence over the minds of people. We are able to steer, as you say, the narrative and steer the conversation in directions that we want it to go. And so when you start talking about these mega machines, these mega institutions, you can literally rewrite a culture through the media. And if you have the same, as we asked Florida, you can have the same narrative going enough times and from enough different angles, in 20 years, the story will be what you wrote it to be and not exactly what it was for real. And so I think that, stories like Different Strokes, stories like, getting blindsided by the blind side. I mean, all of these different stories are there to, one, even soften the blow of what racists and white supremacists have done to black people. Say, no, we've always been altruistic. So then when you juxtapose stories of slave plantations, and white slave masters having non-white children, from raping African women, now it turns into, no, that was Mr. Drummond. That wasn't a bad thing. And that's why I love Jordan Peele's Get Out, because he took that same story and he put a serious spin to that. Said, no. It wasn't altruism. It wasn't love. It was some deeper level of manipulation and desire that was fueling these behaviors.
And you mentioned Florida, Faye. So you think about what we've been talking about so far this morning, the Mississippi situation with those goon squad, all of this, the blind side. We talked about the former president a little bit, at least I did. And then you see what's happening in Florida with the governor and this anti-woke or whatever he calls it. Even sidelining an elected district attorney who's a black woman. It's an all-out assault, Faye, on black folks from all angles. It's like it's a total war, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it does feel like an assault on our consciousness. And I think, as journalists, it's incumbent upon us to report it and talk about the things that are happening. But I think as consumers, we have to be okay with, stopping the scroll, closing our phone, taking a moment. It's okay. It's okay to take a moment from all this because it can be overwhelming. I think we all know folks that just kind of sit in front of CNN all day. And by the end of the day, they're enraged and, have an opinion about everything. It's not healthy. I'll definitely just defer to the experts here on this. But I think, oftentimes my organization, we encourage our users to take a break from social media, take an hour, set those limits. I think all apps have those limits, but, it's important to take breaks from, especially when the news cycle is as tough as it is right now.
Yeah, it's a tough news cycle, but it's one that's never ending now, right? Dr. Menzies.
All right, well, listen, this just popped up in our inbox. Jonathan Majors is now being.
Okay. I don't know where that came from. But Power 96 said we should add him.
Breaking news.
Yeah, breaking news. That's what I thought too. Power 96, we're gonna have to add you one day soon to the broadcast. So a study published in Counseling Psychology that it found that for every 1,002 Black, Indigenous, person of color, BIPOC, across the nation's 45 largest cities, there's only one BIPOC therapist. When compared to the ratio of white individuals to white therapists, 307 to 1 white therapists are they're basically 3 times more accessible for white patients seeking white therapists. One of the study's researchers collected thousands of individual profiles from Psychology Today's therapist directory to compare therapist availability with census data for different ethnicities and languages. The bottom line is that it's 73% of mental health care workers are not people of color. And what kind of problem does that pose? And we'll start with you, Dr. Menzies.
So it could be problematic on many levels. And you know, when you look at the proximity of race and culture between patient and doctor, or patient and mental health service provider, you're not talking just skin. It's not just skin deep. I mean, it goes well beyond it. We're talking about cultural competency, cultural relevancy, cultural humility. We're talking about cultural biases, right? And so, and even cultural ignorance, right? And so when you have a mental health practitioner, because we're basically talking about a person's experience of reality, right? We're talking about how a person perceives reality and how a person has to navigate reality, you know. And so when Sonny was at the car dealership, for example, you know, if he took that to a therapist and said, you know, I test driving the vehicle, got pulled over, you know, I mean, I was nervous, I was afraid. It's like, wow, you know, somebody who doesn't understand the culture within which he exists and his racial identity as it's perceived by others would say, well, I mean, it was just a traffic stop. Why were you so nervous? Why were you so paranoid? It would be a question about that. But somebody, if he came to me, I'd be like, just like he looked at the guy, he said, right, I understood it already, you know, because again, he has trauma points that exist just by virtue of the fact that he exists in this period of time. And so it's not like he's starting at a level baseline, right? It's not like he's, you know, we are starting at 0. We're starting at 15 on a 20 scale already, to where we're going to be hypersensitive. We're going to be hypervigilant. And we can't really depend on people who don't exist within this reality to totally understand that. And it's more important. I think it's probably the most important in the field of mental health service provision, to have that understanding and to have that awareness. And not only that, but to keep it at the forefront of your mind when you're assessing or diagnosing as well as treating people. And I did want to, I'll talk about it. Hopefully we get a chance to, but I want to talk about some of the limitations in this study as well, because, you know, what you were just showing right there, you know, it says these are by, you know, by ethnicity served. And so I've gone through Psychology Today's publication and looked at their service providers. These don't necessarily mean that these people are of the ethnicities that they serve. You know, I could be a white guy and say I serve Native Americans because I took a course, you know, I've got this online certificate. So it doesn't mean that they are themselves Black either.
Oh, yeah. How about
And
that?
And part of it.
And Sonny, in your journey, could you share an instance where your own background and experiences have uniquely benefited someone, making them feel seen and validated in their struggles?
Well, certain. I mean, any given call that I'll get, one of the questions asked by the caller is, sometimes they're awkward. They feel really too forward in asking, but they'll say, do you happen to be Black? And so often I have to verify to them, yes, I'm pretty chocolate, you know. And they're asking that question because that's how relevant, you know, this research is, because it's showing that, you know, there is this huge disparity, and it's pretty clear, as Dr. Menzies alluded to, that you want to go speak with someone that can somehow identify with you. Just take these 2 victims of this horrific police monstrosity up in Mississippi. Like, who who do they sit before? You know, are they going to sit, you know, in front of someone that doesn't identify or relate to their experience? They'll feel alienated. If not anything, they'll feel unheard. Hence, services won't be as effective. So the importance of cultural competency and being able to have that commonality is central. And so with a research study like this, I live it. I see it all the time when, you know, a lot of parents, particularly, they're looking for, you know, persons of color to be able to treat their children, because they just know the role that, yes, we're therapists, but they know that we can also play other roles in this young person's life, such as a mentor, such as like a big brother. We're viewed as much more than just some clinician.
Yeah. Wow. And Faye, it's been pointed out the challenge of finding Black male therapists. How can we work towards breaking down the barriers that prevent more Black men from entering the field of mental health, and what positive impact would increase representation would increased representation have on our community?
Yeah, I mean, I think access and visibility, you know, for sure. If you look at the concentration of where you're more likely to find therapists of color, it's in communities where there are large populations of communities of color, which is great to hear, you know, that we're learning about these fields and we're entering them. But, you know, I do think that the problem is multi-layered. I know as a journalist, I face lots of limitations in finding studies that really talk about what are the unique ways that symptoms present themselves in our communities. I mean, it's really incumbent upon every healthcare provider to be able to recognize the unique needs of unique demographics, right? We're underrepresented in clinical trials. I mean, so I think the problem is layered. It's not just access, you know, it's research, it's also affordability. You know, we're largely uninsured, and therapy is expensive, and we don't want it to be something that is unique for the wealthy or upper middle class. So there are lots of ways I think that we can look at this and impact the therapy services that we absolutely need as communities of color.
Yeah. Dr. Menzies, what systemic changes need to be implemented to create a more balanced and accessible mental health support system for Black communities in particular?
Great question, man. I was at the Congressional Black Caucus Institute down in Mississippi a couple years back, and and there was some Congress men and women who were speaking about the money that they had given to HBCUs, how they support, including Morgan, where I'm at, and so when you looked at that, you said, okay, wow, this is great. And so what I did is I said we need to earmark that money, because we were talking about mental health. I said let's earmark some of those monies to provide scholarships and support for students who are going into the mental health profession. Let's encourage people to come in as psychology majors, social work majors, counseling majors, and then support them going through grad school and support them through the licensure process so that we can increase these numbers, and I think that would be something that we would definitely see a turnaround, but also to support organizations that are doing this work, like the Association of Black Psychologists, for example. So it had the people in the Counseling Psychology magazine looked at ABPSI's listing of service providers on their website. They would have saw almost 100%, African-American or Black identifying providers, right? And I don't know if they were not everybody cross registers or cross lists. So you might have people on ABPSI's list that aren't on Psychology Today's list. Boris Lawrence Henson Foundation, Taraji P. Henson's foundation. I'm part of the clinical advisory board. And what we do, we have this massive network of Black service providers who are not, and provide cultural competency training at the same time. And so it's not enough to just have the same skin tone and come from the same block, but you also, we need to become more culturally aware, culturally humble, and culturally competent in our own right, so, and then the other thing that we kind of talked about it briefly. I know it's a whole nother conversation, but the fact that there aren't enough Black men specifically as well. Because when you look at the demographics, it's around sex, it's 70-something% female and like 20-something% male, right? And so when you look at even that disparity, and a lot of brothers, especially when you talk about couples therapy or even, therapy when they're being forced to go through therapy, they don't feel heard, because a lot of times masculinity itself is seen as being some type of issue. And so I hear it all the time, is they feel a bias, and not only that, but then they feel that the proper response that they're being driven toward is to become more like a woman or more feminine in their approach and their response to situations. When sometimes, a brother comes to Sonny, he just needs to be able to be mad, and Sonny needs to be like, yeah, get mad, bro. Yeah, let that go, bro. Yeah, you should be mad, as opposed to softening it up and making it more of a sense and a more subtle emotion expression.
If I can hook into that for
For
just
sure.
a moment, because I think we can't undervalue too the work of community organizations. I know there's a great organization called Beam in LA, and they go out to barbershops and they train barbers to recognize symptoms and be able to give resourcing. So I think there's some really fantastic ways that communities are stepping into to fill the gaps.
And that same point, just really quickly, Dr. Faye and Billy Shaka, she has a program called Psychotherapy. We went to Howard together, and she's a phenomenal sister. She has Ma'at Psychological Services, and she does exactly that in the beauty salon. She actually has a certification program for hair care providers. I just did a workshop last week at a barbershop in Cincinnati. We called, Shop Talk. Brothers, how y'all feeling?
Awesome.
We had a teamed up with the Black Nurses Association, the Greater Cincinnati, and they did blood pressure readings, and we're over there having shop talk, getting haircuts and talk about blood pressure and natural ways to respond to stress and all that stuff. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there are phenomenal people out here doing the work. We just don't get the spotlight, a lot of times. Yeah.
Yeah,
Good stuff.
absolutely. And Sonny, in the study, Dr. Dana Crawford mentioned the concept of counter-transference.
Oh, yeah,
Can you provide more insight into how this phenomenon affects the therapeutic relationships, especially when cultural nuances are involved?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where, as all therapists are taught, check yourself at the door. The therapist has to go into, treatment of persons, as unbiased as they can. Of course, we all hold bias, but that objectivity is so necessary. But moreover, this has to do with, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Because if the therapist is treating a person and they haven't resolved internal issues with themselves, then countertransference is very likely to occur. So therapists are trained. You're trained, but then of course you have to hold yourself personally to a moral code and moreover ethically, to perform the duty, which is to do no harm. And so with therapists, it's an ongoing evolution, even for the practitioner to constantly improve and to guard against dynamics between therapist and client that would create, problems, where boundaries are crossed. And then there's what we call dual relationships, or moreover, that you end up in mistreatment, misdiagnoses. And then at that point, persons end up getting harmed in the process.
So, and any of you can respond to this. Mike V writes in that the problematizing of Black masculinity impacts the social development of Black men within the community.
Yeah, it absolutely does. There's no question about that. We have this thing, hyper masculinity, toxic masculinity, masculine masculinity. We got all these, and we got all these adjectives to negatively describe masculinity. We've never stepped back and said, well, who's making these definitions? Why is it that we would have to turn down masculinity? What would that actually do? And the answer to that is it will leave our communities even more vulnerable. There's that famous study that story about the elephants in the in Southern African Game Reserve. So when they were trying to transport elephants, they couldn't transfer the adult male elephants because they were too heavy. So they took the women and the children, or the female and the baby elephants, to another game reserve. Well, those teenage male elephants, they started going into must. It's when they're hormones, it's like their puberty. And when there's not an adult male around, it goes unchecked. And so they were like fighting, killing rhinos. We don't know rhinos, but they was damaging property, killing other animals. And they realized it was because the adult male was no longer present, because an adult male is present, that must instantly cuts off in the teenagers. So they literally they fall in line like a black father, a black mother's gaze. It's like, and it just shuts it off immediately. And so, you could use that and say, okay, that can be applicable to our communities as well. When you don't have masculine men, or when you have men who are tiptoeing on what's masculinity, you can't be too authoritative. You can't be too directive, because that's controlling. That's insecure. That's all these other negative things. And reality is protective. And so they would rather for us to not have that protective aspect in our homes and in our communities. So then our children and our families are subjected to external influences, all of which have demonstrated themselves to be against our best interest. And it's been proven to be the case.
Faye McCray, how do you write about something like this? What is the important? What's the most important that we as journalists have to highlight when we see studies like this and have conversations like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important again to report it objectively, but at the same time, as Dr. Menzies pointed out, there are aspects of this that are a bit problematic. It's also, you don't want to get people caught in the doom of it. It's hopeless. I mean, again, there are community organizations. There are lots of people doing work in the field. I think Dr. Menzies just demonstrated why it's so important to have culturally competent therapists that understand the nuances of these issues. So I think making a gateway to resources and making a gateway to hope is really important when we report on statistics like these.
And so, and going along with what Dr. Menzies said, I mean, like you said, Faye, he really hit a home run there. But what strategies, what other strategies, I should say, because I know we've talked about some, but what other strategies or initiatives do you think could help increase the representation of Black therapists in the field?
Yeah, well, I know we saw kind of a rise during the pandemic and companies kind of throwing money at different causes, and there's still lots of money available for small business owners, for community organizations. So I think if you feel like you have a solution in your community, don't be afraid to look for those resources. We talk about them all the time in our content and on our sites. Again, there are all these great organizations, Health in Our Hue, Beam, OutCare if you're in the LGBTQ community. There's these great organizations that have done the research and have paved the path towards finding the resources that you need. So, I would say keep looking, because there are just great organizations doing the work to help us find these solutions to these really dire concerns of mental health in our communities.
Yeah, and Sonny, we talk a lot about the stigma attached to mental health issues in the Black community in particular. Does that stigma also extend toward becoming or wanting to become a Black mental health professional?
I think that could be a complicated answer, because it's probably very layered on so many different levels. I think there's a couple things that factor in. I think primarily it would be the incentives. Is this a lucrative field? Is this something that I want to get into that really is going to provide for me? That's one. So I think, and these are all my opinions, that, for example, Black men, why wouldn't therapy be an option to pursue? I think that sometimes maybe the stigma is this is a field for women, so I'm not going to go into that particular field. I know when I talk to persons, often there's been a few clients of mine, that I've talked to, and just the work that I've done with them, they've actually gone back to school to go study psychology and want to become providers. So I think the main stigma that I would look at that has prevented persons from getting into the field has been the following, and it's burnout. It's not worth it. To what else can I do with this particular degree? And so there's some limitations that come with it. A lot of folks, even think why go to school and become a therapist? I could just be a life coach, and just call it a day. Now we know what life coaching versus therapy is vastly different. However, for some persons, who, Faye mentioned earlier some of the limitations, of, not having the finances to even afford counseling. So if I'm a person, a person of color, who is looking at well, here's a community that's underserved, how am I going to get paid? So you start factoring in, whether or not this is even a career worth pursuing. So in terms of how we can increase the allure to our field, I think it might have to start as early as the middle school levels of trying to attract young people and showing the need for service, not just compensation, but how this speaks now to a more existential development of a young person, if not a college student. Do you want to give back? And therapy, I know, is a very rewarding career, both in terms of if you can find creative ways to make a good living for yourself, but also how you can be versatile even within it, and find various ways to still take care of yourself. But more than that, this is a Mr. Sonny thing, is you're giving back, you're helping people. I mean, sometimes I even tell people, the one title I've always liked when I was, first learning about the field was the term helper. At the end of the day, we could use all the titles. We're just helpers. And so I think even as early as middle school, we can start to lure young people into the field. As far as young men, a lot of guys want to mentor and want to help other people. You know, you help other young men, Black men, for example. Well, here's an avenue through which you can do that. And again, we can start earlier. Now, how does that work? Some of the associations that are that can make it a priority of theirs to really start to recruit and start to make it that much more advertised to young people. You know, this would mean persons such as myself, Dr. Menzies, to partner with different organizations that may not necessarily be programs that are geared towards just mental health, but just mentorship programs, how we can then start to become, if you will, recruiters on some level of bringing in these young guys and making them feel that not only is there room for you to, you know, explore success, but also you can really make a big difference, you know, in the world, and know that you lived a life that was very meaningful through the work that you did as a mental health provider.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about Black men with Faye nowadays, especially perhaps historically, but we see even more and more now where Black women are being attacked left and right. They are being traumatized. They are being body shamed. They are being shamed this way, that way. They're being politicians are attacking them. Can you talk a little bit about the importance for Black women and Black girls and they're having perhaps Black women therapists?
Yeah, I mean, it can't, be underestimated. Just personally, I was sitting with a girlfriend the other day and she was asking me, she has 2 young boys, and she asked me, when was that first time that she felt like the world was dangerous, or that I felt like the world was dangerous for my sons? We both shared, stories about just seeing the way people look at our sons and the toll that it takes on us as women. There's this kind of reclaiming right now for Black women of the soft life and like letting down our guard as strong Black women, and I think it's really, incumbent and very important, on mental health professionals to really understand the nuance of living in this world as a Black woman and understanding those unique needs. I saw a couple of great articles that we did at Psych Central flash across the screen of some fantastic women just doing some great things to help us kind of outside of the realms of just Western medicine and being able to find a therapist, but really find community and address some of these issues and talk about the things that we experience uniquely. But yeah, I mean, it's important. It's important from our bodies to our parenting, to our womanhood. I mean, there is kind of a constant assault on who we are. And it's important that, we are able to address what it's like to live in this world with that lens. And again, there's just some fantastic folks just doing the work and really committed to researching and finding solutions for these issues that uniquely impact us.
So, and Dr. Menzies, finally, just underscore for us, if you will, why this conversation is important, that having Black therapists, particularly as the studies highlighting, seem to have zeroed in, or at least we zeroed in on Black males in particular. Can you just underscore the importance of this?
Yeah, this conversation is necessary because there are people who are clueless about the disparities that exist along racial lines. I mean, even those of us that's going through training in school, I teach on the college level. And one of the first things I do, especially in my theories of personality classes, I show the image from the textbook and say, tell me about these therapists or these theorists that we're going to cover. Every last one of them is white. The majority of them would be considered old, and the other is that they're all but one man. And so it becomes this idea that this is a old white man's profession, and that they're the only ones that can do this, and this is something for them. And so I think conversation like this allows us to expand and dispel that myth, right? And to show that no, it's not a stale discipline. It's not something where you're going to be bored or broke doing it, but you can have swag in this world of mental health profession, right? And it can be very lucrative for you. And the way that I pitch it to younger people is like, hey, who wouldn't want to master human beingness, right? I don't care what else you do in this world. You study psychology, you're studying human beingness. And that puts you as a master of yourself and potentially be able to help others through your own self-mastery. And so when we understand psychology, because this is even a culturally competent way of discussing psychology, right? It's not just the stale, well, you've got psychoanalytical, you've got the humanistic approach, we got this other stuff too, right? And so when we can infuse our swag, put our own seasoning on it, and I think that's what a conversation like this does for us. It allows us to see, wow, I never thought about psychology that way. Wow, I never thought about therapy that way. let me go find me a therapist. You mean to tell me that if I go through therapy, I'm actually helping to develop and heal myself from my childhood stuff, and I can stand stronger today and be less rocked by some of this racism, less rocked and less negatively impacted by societal intrusion into my life? Oh, wow, let me get into that. And so this type of conversation is important for that and many other reasons. And I just think that the more conversation like this we can have, the more we can expose people, especially younger people, you know, to this concept of psychology, this concept of therapy, this concept of mental illness, this concept of mental healing and wellness. I think the better off we're going to be as a community, because we'll be less vulnerable to a lot of these things that are attacking us right now.
And Sonny, your last thoughts on this topic before we have to close it up.
Yeah, no, my final thoughts are, I love what I do. I enjoy what I do. And I want so much more of folks that look like me to join me in this fight, in this struggle. The topic we covered earlier with these two men in Mississippi is not an isolated incident. We're hurting. We've been hurting and we need healing. And so we want more healers. We want more helpers to join us in this fight, in this struggle. And to Dr. Menzies' point, come all. We can take who we are. We could hip hop this thing. We can soul this thing. We can put some seasoning on this thing. And I think we can transform. We could transform this particular profession the way we've transformed so many other sectors and disciplines by making it our own thing. So in the words of Heavy D, we got our own thing.
Sonny gave us some music and seasoning. So now I'm hungry. I want to listen to some music. Faye McCray, your final thought on this topic for this morning.
Let's just keep talking about it. Let's keep being loud. Let's keep being widespread. This isn't just our problem to solve. You know, this is an American problem. This is a U.S. problem. So let's just keep talking about it as loud as we can.
Yeah, Faye McCray, a health and wellness journalist. Sonny Etienne, a psychotherapist at Introspective LLC. And of course, Jeff Menzies, a doctor of clinical psychology. We appreciate all of you. And thanks for this valuable conversation this morning. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.